There were two contestants. One was sitting in the first row. He always sits in the front.
He does.
And you going, I like that.
Sorry.
Therapy.
But they guard out there at 8 o'clock. But the rabbis don't.
Was Jewish time.
I guess.
Good afternoon.
Can you believe that? I'm sure I can't, my kids were like, so I told my kids.
So your colors really pretty.
Nice. No.
What do you hear from your
Oh,
kids?
come on, there's no.
Well,
way.
we have a Golani soldier that
So they're like.
is on the ground. We can only assume we know where he is, but we don't know where he is.
However, people looking at it on their phone.
Was on the Gaza border.
Oh my God, you're right.
It's not long with the other kids did.
And your daughter.
So they saw him. They got a phone call from Samantha's phone that he was going. They had seen the house right now, in 15 minutes. So they drove over an hour to see.
Oh, one of the person was picking.
They brought him. I can't share the picture, but I can show you the picture.
Whether she wanted.
And I like sort of like granola bars and power drinks in a bag.
I know, you'd be like, for a teacher.
And one granddaughter is. Watch it with her. The other twin.
You can't watch it, I just forget that channel.
I could put them in my computer. I see, he's got an answer.
And they're all your daughters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't figure out. It's on. Is it called?
Yeah, we'll have people,
I muted that part.
yeah, we'll ask people to write questions in chat. All right, do you want to get us begin or, because I muted them because I heard. I think that that's probably better. Yeah, all right. Yeah, if I set it up now in my service, but you are muted. I mean, if someone wants to ask a question, I want to unmute it. Yeah, you know, yeah. Once.
We never saw him, I never saw him. You know.
She's my TV critic.
Our daughter was there, Kelly, and Sophie came from Syracuse. We saw none of them, and we couldn't get.
You couldn't see any of your.
We haven't heard.
No, because they had no cell phone. Marcia was trying to cell. Marcia kept saying. We were
There were too many people
texting
there with
us
cell
to
phones.
say where, I don't know why, but we had no.
Yeah, I just saw it was
So that they intentionally diminished cell capacity so that in the event there was a remote,
Ellie,
bomb threat or something. Apparently on a remote bomb. Cell phone. But I'm sure this is a conspiracy theory, I don't believe it.
Okay.
There were 200,000 people, all the cell phones trying to get on.
That's what I thought. Yeah, right, and I couldn't make calls or pictures.
Jay said, they were trying to find us, so he's like, turn the Wi-Fi off, I have the Wi-Fi on, I was in airplane mode, he's got all these ways.
just a mustache.
You know, there's like a week.
Yeah.
If you
Okay.
remember from.
Right, Deborah and I both, so we knew that the Philly group was supposed to run
In a certain place.
in a certain place in front of like one of the TV monitors on the left, and there was a monitor on the left.
Mustaches.
And we ran across a
Every
few.
soldier now.
There was.
I didn't know either.
It just happens.
Because we didn't see that many kids.
I asked him, what's your favorite? He said it's a
She
trend.
must have been in that. He didn't know the history of it.
But there was a special TV program, and part of
She left.
part of the grandmother had a
So Sophie left at 4 a.m. I said, I know she had a 7.5 ride home. Because we got home after 3 hours. She said, I have 4.5 more hours.
because she was coming from Syracuse. Yeah. Yeah, that's what it was.
But it was certainly.
It was really.
Very
Yeah.
It's with the state.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, the most, yeah, yeah. It's starting to wasn't yeah, burns really nice. Yeah, exactly.
All right, does anyone need to buy anything from Israel, from the gift shop? We have lots of stuff. You haven't been in a while.
It's open now?
Take a look. Anyway. So that's what we said. We were all there.
Yes, we were.
I think
I guess I'm not here with it, organized it.
The Federation of Great
How many rabbis from this
How do they do with this project, kids?
Our rally.
Were you there?
Yeah.
I was at Wendy's and Thomas. Yeah, it's quite an excuse.
Fred said, do I want to sign, so I went.
Well, no, it would have thought. Your name. What?
I think it's
I see this.
I think that's something that's.
There was somebody standing in front of us.
I only said that in response to you.
Yes, you did. All right, I'm gonna see if I can see how many people are. Oh, wow. Ladies and gentlemen. Erev Tov.
היה מצוין.
כן?
היה מצוין.
כן, אתמול היה...
דיברתי עם האח שלי, הוא אמר לי, תודה רבה,
כמעט 300,000 people. It's just
Yeah, and the women there was 250,000 more.
Yeah.
So you know, it gives us energy.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Jewish community.
All right, folks, I'm going to invite people who are in the room to grab a little something to drink, take a seat. I see that there look like there are about 55 screens, no, 66 screens on Zoom, wow. Wow.
$50, we could raise.
I know, this could be a great fundraiser. This could be a great fundraiser. Thank you all for being here tonight. I want people to know that if you're on the Zoom, we're sharing my screen because I have a PowerPoint with some photos that I'm going to be talking a little bit about tonight. And so we're not seeing any of your faces if you're on the Zoom at the moment. But I want to just, if I can, for those of you who are, okay, there's, for instance, the cantor is now helping us to see a few faces. Is everyone on the Zoom able to hear me right now? Let's see, if you're able to, Patty and Al first, if you can hear me, wave your hand. You can hear me, that's a good thing. That means everyone can hear me. Excellent, excellent. Okay, so we're going to minimize those on the screen because we are, and if we will have time, I want to make some time for questions if people have questions. For those of you who are on the Zoom, please feel free to put questions into our chat. So I'm planning just to talk a little bit about these extraordinary 2.5 days that I spent in Israel last week. I want to first mention that this trip was made possible by our Philadelphia Jewish Federation. And for those of us who took the buses yesterday to the rally as well, I want to just also say that I kind of think of the Federation sometimes like I think of Beth Shalom congregation in some ways. We're always here and around when you need us. And it's important for people to remember that because we do have all these incredibly wonderful organizations that are doing incredible things for the Jewish community and for the world. But there are these kind of fundamental bedrock institutions that make a lot of things possible. And we would not have been able to come to our 18 buses that came from Philly, plus I think 16 other buses of day school students from Philly. That has nothing to do with how many people came on their own to get there, but just the kind of craziness of having to organize how that would happen and making sure those buses were there, and there were captains of the buses to make sure people got on the bus going. It's an extraordinary undertaking, and we kind of just assume that someone's going to take care of it and make it happen, just like we assume that Beth Shalom will be here when there's something that happens, whether it's joyful or sometimes sad. So it made me appreciate the fact that we have a federation, having just come from the Israel 75 mission that our beloved Josh, Zichrono Livracha, and Jess were co-chairs of, which was also a federation.
They asked if they could have the camera on you.
Oh, the camera on me, that's right. Are they able to see, wait, Jacob, what are people, oh, they want to see me before we get to the slides. Okay, so I guess I'll stop the share. All right. Can you guys see me now? Is that some, those of you on screen, wave if you can see me.
They can't see.
Oh, I have my camera on, that's right. Okay, so if I stand here, people, I think, should be able to see me. Do we have to highlight the person who's speaking kind of thing so that they'll see not me in a little square? I'm just asking the tech support here at Beth Shalom Congregation.
So we still don't see you. How do they mute? Oh, that's Stacy. Okay.
You still don't see me?
Oh, now we do. Now we do.
We see you 3 times.
Okay, so I was just talking, I think at least people were hearing me, yes? So I was talking a little bit about Federation and what Federation and Beth Shalom have in common. We're around for you. So I left Saturday night after Shabbat from Newark.
and got into Israel Sunday afternoon. And it's too bad that I just stopped the share of the screen because I wanted to show you my first slide. Okay, hold on a second. Now I'm going to share screen again. Oops, that's actually, I probably did that without. Hold on. Let me do that. Because I have to share it with, okay, share it with sound. Am I sharing it as a slide presentation in the beginning? Mm-hmm. All right. I want to go back. Okay, so this is the first, you get off, when you get off at Ben Gurion, this is the first thing that you see. And it goes on for as far as the eye can see. These are photos, individual photos of the 240 plus hostages that are currently held in Gaza with their names, their ages, and that was my first vision of Israel, is the hostages. And the thing that I think is very, very important, I have more photos from this square in Tel Aviv, which is in front of the Museum of Art and right opposite the headquarters of the IDF, is that there's essentially constant reminders in Israel of the fact that 240 are being held. And you may have heard today it was announced that there's going to be a march from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem that is going to end at the Prime Minister's office on Shabbat from families who have loved ones who are being held hostage. So this is so much a part of Israel's consciousness right now. For any of us who were at the rally yesterday in DC, we heard from several parents of those who are being held hostage right now. And, you know, a lot of what Israelis want to say to the world is that you cannot start talking about strategic balances and with a terrorist group that is holding 240 human lives, some of them children as young as 3 years old, as hostages, and that the families of these 240 Israelis, the one thing that we heard over and over again is, do not let the world forget that we have, as we heard yesterday, one of the parents of the hostages say, our children are essentially buried, we hope alive, underground right now. They're buried, we hope alive, underground right now. And we don't stop thinking about them for a minute, and nor should you. So one of the messages I want to bring back from these 2.5 days is that we can't forget, and we ought not to forget. And I do have a couple of ideas that I wanted to talk about with our Israel engagement chairs about how we as a community can keep the names and faces of those families in our consciousness during this time of their captivity. So this is my introduction to Israel. And so our first program was not scheduled until 7:30 in the evening on Sunday night. And I wanted to share with you, this was just something that, I posted this on our Beth Shalom Facebook account, but I'm not assuming that everyone is subscribed to Beth Shalom's Facebook group. But this is the Tayalet in Tel Aviv. We were staying at the Sheraton in Tel Aviv, and I wanted to see if I could. All right, Chazan, if you're still in the room, thank you. Whoops, that's not what I wanted. I want to see if I can play this, but I can't get underneath that graph thing. And you figured this out earlier today when we did our run through.
Yeah.
All right, what I want you to, forget about it. Okay, there you go. Oh, you almost had it. Well, it's okay. I don't know how you can, we're trying to get the play button to play, but there's a series of things at the bottom of the screen.
Why are you doing that?
All right, we'll do without it. It's not that. All right, here you go. Okay, so what you're looking at is from this view of the Tayelet, you're looking at Jaffa. And do you see off to the right at the top there's a mosque? Right? And what you just heard, and what I heard on Sunday, was the call to prayer of the mosque. And it was so striking that here in the midst of this war and this horror, there are Muslim Israeli citizens who are worshiping freely in this country, which is, this is not meant to be a political statement about as the quality of life of, but the fact that in the state of Israel, at a time of war, that there are tens of thousands of citizens, Muslim citizens of the state of Israel who are free to worship was incredibly striking to me. That's why I filmed that 15 seconds, that the call to prayer was audible from that place. Which is, again, I think, as much as Israel is so easily demonized in the world, the fact that there are people who are free to practice their religion in this country should never be underestimated. Okay, so now I want to just tell you our first program, before I program was Sunday evening at the Hilton in Tel Aviv. And we first had a conversation with Gil Troy. Many of you know who Gil Troy is. He is a historian, American, who teaches at McGill, but also lives in Jerusalem, Israeli citizen, 4 kids. 2 of them are now serving in the army. He writes a lot about the history of Zionism. He's currently writing a book that should be published in a couple of months with Natan Sharansky about Sharansky's years in the Gulag, and many of us who were at the rally yesterday got to hear Natan Sharansky as one of the featured speakers. But he was speaking not so much as a historian, but he was speaking as a person who wanted us all to bear witness. Earlier that day, he had been at the funeral of a 23-year-old, very close friend of his son's who was killed in action in Gaza. He had, Gil Troy that is, had been 2 months earlier at his wedding. And so having, witnessed the simcha of this young man's wedding, and he had only 2 more months left of fulfilling his time of service. He said to us, in order to win a war, you have to win a war with broken hearts. And we are a country who is never more than a half degree of separation away from someone who is suffering greatly at this time. And our hearts are broken collectively. And what he asked us to do is to say that there are some times when you need help in the red lines that you have to draw. And he was talking here about the state of Israel and what it must do to defend itself. Here's another one of his great quotes, which was, "A humanitarian ceasefire is an oxymoron." That was a quote. And the idea is obviously that we know, and there's a 47-minute video film that I don't know if any of you have seen any of it, but it just shows the kinds of atrocities that were committed because so many of the terrorists were wearing video cameras so that they could actually video their slaughter. And so the idea that Israel is being called upon, and again, we want Israel to be as humanitarian as possible, but the idea that those who have just butchered children and pregnant women and elders are asking us to, which we need to do, is to care about civilian casualties with an enemy that purposely embeds itself within civilian targets and hospitals, as we are now witnessing today. The hospitals where Hamas operates out of. That is just something that for Israelis, the red line that they have to draw is that Hamas can no longer be allowed to control Gaza. And whatever has to be done to make sure that Hamas is not in a position to control Gaza is what Israel feels called to do. The thing that we were very, and I'll talk more about this later, is that there are close to 200,000 Israelis. This doesn't get much press in this. There are close to 200,000 Israelis who no longer are able to live in their homes. Some because they're too close to Hezbollah in the north, and many because they're too close to Gaza. And there are profound consequences for those, and these are areas, the areas around Gaza where people are no longer able to actually live in their homes right now. There is not a single map in the world that doesn't assign the land around Gaza to the state of Israel. And people can talk about pre-1967, after 1967, that land there is no dispute that that is the land of Israel, but Israelis can't live in that land because it's too dangerous for them to live there. So he went on to say that we need your help in saying this is a red line, that the world will tell us we're crossing the red line. We need your help in letting the world know that the red line is that we can no longer allow Hamas to control this territory. And there's no going back to business as usual. That simply is unimaginable for Israelis at this point. And the last thing I wanted to say is that the goal, he said, of the terrorists is not only to have no Jews in this land, but it's to rob us of joy. And we are not going to allow terrorists to rob us of the right to joy. But I want to just emphasize that what he was calling upon Americans and American Jewish community to do is some of what we were there doing yesterday, is to say we stand with Israel, and Israel has every right to rid itself of those who seek its. Okay, sorry, okay. I've got to not touch, I can't touch my touch screen. Let's go to the next, I'm going to go to the next slide so it won't be there anymore. Okay, all right.
If you press on the video, then it turns on.
All right, well, let's go to the next slide, so I
guess
never
not,
have to hear it. Okay. So then after Gil Troy spoke, we met with two women, one of who grew up at Kibbutz Kfar Aza. Many of you have heard that that was the site of one of the worst parts of the atrocities of October 7th. There are 400 members of the kibbutz. Over 50 were murdered on October 7th. That's 1/8 of the kibbutz, and over 20 are currently held hostage from that kibbutz. And those who were murdered from that kibbutz were among the worst of the atrocities, the dismemberments and all the other sorts of things. Were from that kibbutz. So I'm going to focus on one of the two speakers who spoke to us, who lives on that kibbutz. Her name is Yamit Ashkenazi. She's in this photo. And she is the mother of 3 children, ages 6, 4, and 3, and she has a husband who's now serving in the IDF. And she and her husband and 3 kids were on the kibbutz that day. And she said, when people ask me, why do I live here? She said, because 95% of the time I'm living in heaven. 5% of the time I'm living in hell. And she said the morning of October 7th was a day of hell, of pure hell. And they heard the alarms that went off in the kibbutz, and then they heard gunshots. And so they have safe rooms in this kibbutz. So she and her husband locked themselves in a safe room with their 3 children, age 3, 4, and 6. And she was on the phone with her sister, who also lived on the kibbutz in a different section of the kibbutz. And she was saying that she, could hear that there were gunshots on the line coming right outside her sister's apartment. And she was on the phone listening to the machine gun fire when the call went dead. And her sister, Doron, is 30 years old, and she is one of the 240 hostages. And in this picture, she's holding a picture of her sister. The terror that she described of being the mother of 3 young children in a safe room, that's, again, a safe room. It's supposed to keep you safe from a bomb, right? But if you're in a safe room where you have, people with grenades and machine guns, that can be your death room. And she kept saying to her kids, the army's going to come to save us. They'll be coming to save us. They'll come to save us. It turned out that they were in that room with no food, basically, for 21 hours. 21 hours. And what she says she thinks saved them were the fact that they have 2 dogs who were not in a safe room, but who were clearly going crazy and barking. And she believes that it is the barking of those dogs that prevented the terrorists from breaking into their home and doing what they did to so many other members of the kibbutz who were also hiding in their safe rooms when they were murdered. So she talks about how after 21 hours that they heard finally Hebrew and soldiers outside, but they were so terrified they wouldn't even open the door to be rescued. They were too unsure. And finally, they were convinced that it was finally safe to leave. And she herself, she is the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And she said she experienced what happened was like a pogrom. And the thing that was most heartbreaking for me, there were so many heartbreaking moments. One of the heartbreaking moments was, I was sitting next to her at a table as we were having dinner, and after she had spoken, and I had said, by the way, a short humorous aside, we were fed very well on this emergency mission. This emergency mission had some very good food. I had a really good steak on Sunday night, kosher. But she was saying, I said, will you be able to go back? Will you be able to go back and live on a kibbutz that's literally 2 miles from Gaza? And she said, I am not sure I'll ever feel safe enough to go back there to live. Now, I want to say that the majority of the narrative that we heard from so many Israelis is we're going to rebuild, we'll come back even stronger, we'll double the number of people who are living here. I heard that message a lot. So, but I want to complicate your narrative as I feel like my own narrative was complicated. There are people who are just so traumatized that they may not be able to go back. I mean, think about it. Your home is the place that's supposed to be your shelter and your sanctuary. And you're in what is called your safe room. So this young woman with 3 little kids may never go back to live on the kibbutz that she grew up at. She grew up at this kibbutz. Her parents happened to be out of the country. That was a miracle, she said. They were visiting relatives outside the country. They weren't there the day of the attack. But this is where she grew up. This is where her sister lives. Husband. She may never go back to that kibbutz. The last person we spoke to on our first night there was a reporter for Channel 13, Alon Ben David. He's a military reporter. And I wanted to share a couple of things that he said to us. He said, we're forever changed from this, and we now see clearly that they never had any intention of coexistence. They never had any intention of coexistence. And as a military reporter, he said there are 9 hospitals in Gaza. Almost all of them have command and control centers underneath them. That's what he, as a military reporter, has, I assume, reason to know. And that's what's being debated right now with Israel going into the hospital in Gaza City. He said, we can't know what the day after will look like, and our senior military and intelligence command now carries the burden of guilt for not having understood that this could happen to us. But he said, this is a war for our very existence. And here's the last thing I want to share with you that he said. He said, we can't eliminate the idea of Hamas, but we must destroy the capacity of Hamas. And I think that that's very succinct. And he also said, and this is something that also was chilling to me, but he said, look, once we finish with what we have to do in Gaza, even if the north stays quiet, we have to go into the north and do something similar. We're living under too much of a threat. The threat militarily from Hezbollah is even more significant than what the military capacity of Gaza and Hamas is. So as much as we are now praying for a quick dismemberment of Hamas and its ability to conduct its raids. We may also be watching what may, according to this military reporter, that after Gaza, Israel may turn its attention to the north and to Hezbollah. Okay, so that was our first day in Israel. Here's Alon Ben David, who had a cast on his arm. You can see on his right arm he has a cast. He apparently was doing a filming segment on an Israeli tank, and he fell off the tank, and that's why his arm is in a cast. Was not in combat. Okay, here's your rabbi with another rabbi from Philly. You can tell what we're doing. We are harvesting pomegranates, and some of us are harvesting, some of us are catching, and some of us are putting them in. The reason this is not to show you how adept your rabbi is at catching pomegranates, but to say that the single most significant source of agricultural workers in the state of Israel are people from Thailand. And the government of Thailand, after October 7th, basically said you should all come back to Thailand, and purchased free transportation to get back to Thailand and leave Israel, which means that a significant amount of produce that is ripe and ready to be picked and feed the country is sitting in the fields right now. And remember, there were 360,000 reservists who were called up to duty. So the volunteer pool of who can come and do some of this agricultural work is diminished. So look, we did a token amount of harvesting, but I wanted to show you the slide to just say that the economic toll that this is taking on the state of Israel is beyond comprehension. Just so many people are no longer are serving right now, and so many people have left. So it's a huge economic toll that is being taken. One of the just many small ways in which I'll just mention that we saw so many acts of everyday heroism of just your ordinary Israelis. So any of us in this room who are on the Israel 75 mission know that we had a wonderful tour guide named Yonah, who was one of our 4 tour guides. But Yonah was this tour guide for the group of us, 7 rabbis from Philly, 5 rabbis from northern New Jersey, and our Federation CEO and his wife, and the number 2 of the CEO of Northern New Jersey Federation. So there were 15 of us. So Yonah was our guide for this 2.5 days. What he said to us was, on October 6th, I had the next 9 months, my calendar was completely full with tours that I had booked. On October 9th, I had no tours. You are my first people I have done anything with since October 7th. But what was he doing between October 7th and our tour? He was volunteering and going to moshavim and kibbutzim and doing harvesting as a volunteer, 62 years old. And that's what all the Israelis who have the capacity to do things are doing. That's one of the things that you feel in that country like it's the day after 9/11 every day at this point. Remember when everyone couldn't be nicer and was donating blood and doing all these great things for each other? That's what's happening in Israel. It happens, as a matter of course, so much more so than it does in this country, just because people feel so connected to each other. But in a time like this, it's just, you see so many examples of people. This is in Ofakim. Ofakim is again, in the belt around Gaza. And what you're watching is, this is a fairly small town, which was, again, attacked relentlessly by the terrorists. And there were basically a group of 50 civilians who managed to keep, I don't remember the number of terrorists that had come into their town, but managed with, in their slippers and bathrobes and pajamas and some pistols, managed to mostly keep a group of terrorists at bay. And I read an account of one of the police officers who was from Ofakim, who had been on patrol near the rave, and then heard what was going on and went back to Ofakim, and basically he just had his handgun and not a lot of rounds of ammunition, so he could only fire very judiciously because he didn't have the ammunition, and then only when they had killed terrorists could they then take terrorist guns and then turn it on the other terrorists. But you had people mostly in their pajamas, woken up it was first thing in the morning when this happened, and they were able to save many, 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 many lives in Ofakim without these mostly civilians, with a couple of their police people, until they could get help. They held them off for about 5 hours. But they lost 70 residents of this community. No, I'm sorry, this was 50. 50 of their citizens were killed. And what you're watching here in this photo is these are essentially memorials that are dedicated to the people who died from Ofakim, and daily people come and light yard-side candles up until, this was before the Shloshim, before the 30-day period. So you see photos of people, memorials, and then yard-side candles lit by residents of the community. Okay. So in Ofakim, you may have heard this story. This is the window outside the apartment of a woman named Rachel Edri. I don't know if any of you read the story about Rachel Edri. So she's someone who was born in Iran and knows some Arabic. And you can see all of the machine gun bullet holes outside the window of where she lived. So there were 5 terrorists that came and broke into her home. And immediately, as soon as they got in, she basically said, "You must be hungry. You must be tired." And she fed terrorists and talked to the terrorists. She and her husband. And she kept them there in communication for 15 hours until a force from Israel's army could actually come in and then storm the apartment and ultimately take out the 5 terrorists. And she nor her husband were harmed at all. But this story got unbelievable press, particularly in Israel, because she managed to basically use this idea, which seems just so completely antithetical, but of kindness and goodness that allowed them to not finish their mission until help could arrive.
Rabbi, I want to ask
No, I want to add an anecdote to that story.
Sure.
I have a lot of friends that live at Kibbutz Urim,
Uh-huh.
which is the next bus stop after Ofakim. And the kibbutz was hardly touched. Amazingly, it became famous for people saying, God must have really been right on your kibbutz or something. But really, when I talked to a friend a few days later, and I said, why do you think this happened? And she said, we're not really sure, but it seemed like a whole lot of terrorists got stopped at Ofakim for some reason, and they never came and attacked them.
Well, there are, it's true. For those of you on the Zoom, Hank was saying that there's a kibbutz next door to Ofakim that really didn't get any destruction from the terrorists, and there's a kind of randomness to this quality. There are a couple of characteristics that at least some other places had, but one of the well, I'll get to that in a little bit. There's so many things that came up anecdotally, and I don't want to. I really want to try to give you a real sense of some of the impact of. But this woman, the story of her being able to keep them in her home until they could be rescued was just incredible. I don't have a slide that shows you the woman we met in Ofakim from Sipor, but one of the incredible groups that we met is there are people who work at something called the Israel Trauma Center, and one of their main locations is in Ofakim. And what their Israel Trauma Center is to provide support to those not only in Israel, but they do training where there are traumatic events happening across the world. And so the Israel Trauma Center has gone to Ukraine and provide trauma care to Ukrainian citizens who have been traumatized by the war. But clearly they're one of their main satellite locations actually is in Ofakim. And we met this woman, Sipora, who's a social worker, who was saying that we can't start treatment with people. They are way too traumatized for us to do any treatment whatsoever with people at this point. Because you can't do trauma care when people are still traumatized. But one of the things that they are doing is that they are mobilizing social workers and psychologists from around the country to receive trauma care training, because there is so much trauma that now has happened in this country. So part of what they are doing is not only tending to their own in Ofakim, but they're training mental health professionals. And they call this work resilience work. That's the language they use in Israel. They call it resilience work because they think that some Israelis may have negative stereotypes around calling something therapy. Well, I don't need therapy. But you need resilience. And the only way you can become resilient is that if you have someone you can give speech to what you have experienced. And so there are these incredible mental health care professionals who are not only trying to provide care, and they told us that they have so much work to do with the first responders, whether it was the soldiers or civilian or police forces that were the first to get to the scenes of this and then have to witness the atrocities. But the trauma care needs in the country are just incredible. I'll also tell you about another amazing, this was all on the same day in a different location, which I can't even tell you where it is. Somehow the tour company that provided the tour for our group had a connection with a person who is in what's called Unit 504 of the Israeli Intelligence Services. Unit 504 is the unit that is responsible for doing interrogations of people enemies who are taken alive, obviously might have some very important and valuable intelligence information. So we got to go to a base. We couldn't know where it was. Couldn't take a single picture, obviously. We're not allowed to talk about too many of the things that it was like, what are we allowed to tell people about? And they kept, the person we spoke to, said he couldn't go into a lot of detail on any of our questions. But he did say that because, that first of all, he said, under no terms are any of those we interrogate tortured. There is no torture of any person taken prisoner in Israel. Because how do you get information from people was the question. Now, how they do get information but the person who was speaking to us is fluent in Hebrew, English, and Arabic, and that's, he's been doing this, he's been with part of this unit he's in his now early 40s. He was called back as a reserve to be part of this unit. But we were actually, we passed the rooms where they take Hamas soldiers who are alive for interrogation. And they have found, he was able to say, we have found incredibly valuable information from our interrogations. It's allowed us to learn about where we want to make, strikes, and to be very precise about how we do strikes. The person we spoke to who does these interrogations told us, and we've heard it confirmed by many others since we heard it from him, that Israel had been saying to Palestinians that you need to go south. You need to get out of the north. We cannot guarantee your safety in the north of the country. And many, many Palestinians who were trying to flee were shot by Hamas. Because Hamas knows that when the world sees dead Palestinians, that it will blame Israel. And so he was the first of a few people who confirmed that, and not every person there are tens of thousands of people who have been able to flee south, but there are apparently many, many who were told not to leave, and if they did leave, they were shot or fired upon by Hamas. This was something unbelievable that he told us, that they found that among those who were part of the attacks on October 7th, there was a 9 and an 11-year-old who were actually, and we were told that, and again, not from this guy from the intelligence services, but we were told that that the IDF found evidence of drugs that many of the soldiers were likely told to take before they began the rampage, kind of like an ecstasy type of drug that brings you a kind of euphoria, and that would keep them awake for hours and hours so that they could be in this drug-induced, morally absent state to do. And they found on the bodies of some of the Hamas soldiers, they found the medications. Okay. So we ended our first day back in Tel Aviv, and you were looking at a lower level of a hotel 2 blocks to our south of where we were staying at the Crown Plaza. So as you know, if there are close to 200,000 Israelis who can no longer live in their homes, where are they living? Well, there are a lot living in Eilat, and there are a lot living in the Dead Sea, but there are many, 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 many living in hotels, because certainly there are no tourists. There are no tourists right now. So this is where many Israeli families are now living. So this most of the residents of the Crown Plaza, which was our neighbor hotel, were people who had been living in Sderot. And I wanted to tell you about Dror Yisrael because that's another organization that we learned about. So Dror Yisrael is an organization that takes young Israelis and brings them out to the periphery of the country where educational opportunities are not as great as they are in the cities, and helps provide supplementary education and after-school care for kids. In normal times, in parts of the country that don't get the kind of educational and after-school services, but now has been mobilized to provide education and after-school care for displaced Israelis. So when you think about 200,000 people who don't have homes, and probably at least a third of them are children, they can't go to school. Or there are some places where they have capacity to take a certain number of kids in a school, but they don't have the physical capacity to take kids. So what are you going to do with all these kids who are... So this is an organization that brings these teachers to where these Israelis are being housed and tries to provide some sense of normalcy by giving them school and education and after-school care. And the one thing that we kept hearing over and over again is that, you know, most of these families of young kids, one of the parents is usually been called up to the IDF, so there's often only one parent at home to take care of these kids, but there's no structure except what can be provided by some of these organizations like Dror Yisrael. And it just, how important it is for a parent who's on call 24/7 in a trauma situation to have like a few hours a day where they're not responsible for their kids is like the greatest gift that you can give a parent of young children. And so this organization is the leading group in the state of Israel that's mobilizing to try to educate kids who've been displaced and give them some sense of some semblance of normalcy. This is another picture of just some of these kids just playing under the supervision of these amazing, mostly women, relatively young women from Dror Yisrael. The other thing that they told us was that because they go to areas where there are some underprivileged kids and kids who sometimes act out, and part of what their mission is to try to, help these kids be able to get the attention they need to be able to function within the context that's in the normal time. Some of these kids who have been most troubled have been recruited to come and provide some of these aftercare services for these displaced kids, and she was saying, like, these kids who were always often labeled as the troubled kids have this incredible sense of purpose that they are providing care to these younger kids who have been displaced. And it's this beautiful thing of, watching these kids give back. That also is just part of the beauty of what you see here. So yeah, they're operating all over the country, and particularly in the areas like Eilat and the Dead Sea, where there are just concentrations of these families. And again, some of them have been displaced from the north, not only just around Gaza. Okay, let me see about next slide. So this woman who's, if you're looking, the woman third from the left with the glasses is this woman named Lucy Aharish. Some of you who watch Fauda, one of the stars of Fauda is a guy named Sah Halevi. But she is an Israeli Muslim Palestinian woman who's married to an Israeli Jewish man who's an actor, and she's a television she does the news, basically on, I forget which channel in Israel. And she basically told the story about, waking up to this news of what was going on October 7th, and watching her husband immediately be called into service. He's an actor. He's leaving. He's on his way to his unit. And she told this unbelievable story about, I guess she must be in her early 40s, because she had this memory of 40 years ago during the first Intifada, right before the first Intifada began, 40 years ago. Her family was living actually in Dimona. Again, a Palestinian Muslim Israeli citizen family who lived in Dimona. Apparently, it was very common for not only Arab Israelis, but for Jewish Israelis to go to Gaza and to go shopping in Gaza. So her family had gone this day 40 years ago to go to Gaza, and they felt like, as soon as she's telling the story, that they got to Gaza and something feels really wrong, like there's no one around. They had wanted to go to this jewelry shop to buy a piece of jewelry for her mother. Just as they pulled up to the shop in Gaza, they see the owner of the shop pulling down he's closing up the shop. He seems very nervous. She says, "Why are you closing?" "Well, things don't look so good," he says. She said, "Can we go in? Can we shop? Can we whatever?" She tells this whole story about, being this little kid and wanting to get like red lipstick, as a little girl to put. She knew her mother would never otherwise let her. But basically, so the owner gives her the lipstick. They buy this piece of jewelry. They get back in the car, and they're heading back to Dimona. And they're sensing now that basically something is really wrong. And she sees this man, and again, she's a little girl at this point, and she sees this man who she's completely scared of, approaching her car before they can cross the border back into Israel. And, that's what I meant to say. The owner of the shop said, "If I were you, I would put something Arabic on the front of your car." Because they have a car with Israeli license plates. Right? So they thought that seemed very strange. They didn't do that. So this man approaches them, and all of a sudden, they see that he's holding 2 Molotov cocktails, and she remembers her father screaming, "We're Arabs, we're Arabs, we're Arabs." And he basically detonates whatever you do to a Molotov cocktail to both of them in their car, and her uncle, who had been in their front seat, was essentially killed. And she told us this because she wanted us to know that, that she herself had first-hand experience with terrorism. And she said no one in Gaza helped them. It was Israelis who came and got them out and took them to the hospital. And she said, "Look, I have been, and I am I'm a huge critic of the current government coalition in Israel," she was saying to us. But what happened on October 7th is not about the Israel-Palestine conflict. In her mind, it is purely anti-Semitism. And she says that as an Israeli Arab. And she told us that, look, people need to wake up. That this is not just about Israel. This is about a fight for ultimately good and evil. And it's happening here, but it's going to be happening in a lot of parts of the world. And then she told another incredible story about her being on the phone with basically a platoon mate of her husband's she got a call that someone that she knew was in one of the kibbutzim was under threat from Hamas, and so her husband's platoon mate was the one who was sent to try to rescue them, and so she was on the phone until he had to get off the phone to try to rescue them, and that 4 hours later she got a text from the platoon mate that his friend's family their lives had been saved. So she was a very powerful speaker, and she told the story about how her own family struggles with her marrying a Jew, and her being, the role that she has in Israeli society. But again, it was very powerful to hear her words. I want to show you now, these are scenes outside of the Israel Museum of Art. This is the beginning of a table for 244 people, a Shabbat table. We tried to do that for our own Israel Shabbat of one table. There's 240 seats, empty seats, and each seat has the picture of a different Israeli held captive. Here are tents. There are family members of the hostages who are actually camping outside. This location is right outside the main offices of the IDF senior leadership of the Israel Defense Forces, because the parents of these hostages and family members feel they don't want any Israeli member of the IDF to go to work without having to be reminded of the 240 hostages. And here's just a photo of 3 of them, and all of them under the age of 20. This is a picture of, I think many of you know that we have one of our partner cities is Netivot for the Philadelphia Jewish Federation. And we met with the mayor of Netivot, Yechiel Zohar. And what you're looking at is essentially the command and control center. Now, Hank was talking about a kibbutz that got very little death and destruction on October 7th. Netivot is much closer to Gaza than several of the places that had major casualties. And part of what we learned is that this very forward-thinking mayor of Netivot had installed this kind of this security network 15 years ago when no one was really thinking this seriously about security. And when they had the first warnings that there were terrorists, they were able to close all of the gates to Netivot to make sure that people could not enter Netivot from the 2 or 3 different entrances, because now it's a city of over 40,000 people. And because of this command and control center, they were able to deploy people where they saw that there were terrorists. They showed us the video footage they have of their own police force mobilized and actually taking out this group of Hamas terrorists. But part of it is that this mayor had been forward-thinking enough to provide this kind of security. And many of the dollars to purchase a lot of this equipment came from our region in Philadelphia. So Netivot has been able to be somewhat normal, and school is in session, and families haven't had to evacuate and leave. But part of it is because this mayor had the foresight to create this kind of security apparatus. Here you have just one of the many impromptu food distribution centers that have been set up around the Negev, where food is collected from across the country and then stored for people to pick up. One of the things we learned is that there are a certain number of Israelis, many of them elders, who are too afraid even to go out to purchase food in a grocery store. One of the powerful things that Yona, our tour guide, said to us is that in Israel we don't measure distance in terms of kilometers, we measure distance in terms of seconds. So if you live in Tel Aviv, you have 90 seconds from the time that a siren goes off. And by the way, all of us downloaded the Homefront Command app that tells you when a rocket has been launched that may not be intercepted by the Iron Dome system. So you have 90 seconds to get to a bomb shelter in Tel Aviv. But in this area around Sderot, Gaza, 15 seconds, 20. And so many of these people who are still around don't feel safe going to the store. So not only is the food distributed, but they have volunteers who come and deliver food. And they were saying that, again, many of these people will not answer the door when you knock to drop off their food. You have to leave it outside the door. They're too afraid to open the door. So I want to show you what I think is kind of the face of evil. So this is just one look at one car. This is, we were taken to, there are 2 storage lots where they towed all of the cars that were essentially incinerated by the terrorists. Most of them had 2, 3, 4 people. Again, you have to remember, many of them were at the rave, the dance party that was taking place there. So many of them were in their teens and their 20s. And it wasn't enough to just use machine guns and make sure people were killed with machine guns, but many of them, most of these were, they were rocket-propelled grenades that are meant to be used on tanks. That was the weapon of choice. And that's what a car looks like that's been hit by an RPG. I don't know if you can see how far back that goes and how many completely destroyed vehicles there are. And this is the smaller of the 2 lots in the area. And I assume many of you know the reference to the shoes at Auschwitz, right? That's what the head of security who gave us this tour said. This is what it reminded him of, the shoes at Auschwitz. So here's our group talking to this man, Rafi Babian, who was the person who was the head of security for the Sderot Negev region. And he was responsible for trying to keep these villages, moshavim, kibbutzim, secure, but they were so taken by surprise that as it was unfolding, there was not a lot of information initially coming to the control center. So he went out in his car to try to see if he could learn more information about what was going on, because he was just getting these very scattershot reports of there being, a terrorist here, a terrorist there. And so he went out in his car, and he had with him his a loudspeaker or something that, it's in his car, because he does security and has to, and so he was saying that there were a number of cars of people who were clearly terrified trying to get lost, and he knows the area, so he at first said, follow me. He shouts out of the loudspeaker, the megaphone, follow me. So he has a group of cars following him. He's telling us the stories. He sees up ahead that there are several convoys of terrorists that are shooting. And so he immediately shouts into the megaphone, turn around, follow me. So he makes this U-turn, and these cars, there's a line of about 40 cars, he says, that are now following him back away from where he had just been coming from, because there are these terrorists in front. Then he gets a report over his walkie that if they keep going straight for another half mile, they're going to have another group of terrorists that are going to await them. And so he shouts out of his megaphone, follow me, and he turns off the road and goes into these fields, agricultural fields. And he said there were about 40 cars that were in this convoy. About 30 of them followed him, but 10 of them said, my car's too small, too narrow, too low, I'll get stuck in the fields. And they continued on. And none of them survived. But all of them who followed him survived. So, I think this man may, may himself have been responsible for saving 75 people's lives. And he told us that before this happened, he had been someone who had worked to try to help find gainful employment for Gazans who were working in Israel.
Did we meet him in May?
We probably did, yeah. Yeah, he had probably a different story when we met him in May.
He told us about his friends in Gaza. He told us about his friends in Gaza that had been working with him for many, many years.
And he told us, Ronnie, you know what he told us when we saw him? He said not one of those friends that he had been working and helping earn 5 or 6 times what they could earn in Gaza and Israel had called to check in. Not a single one. Hadn't heard from a single one. And the other thing that was just haunting is that, and I heard this from that woman Yamit, whose sister is being held. They have reason to believe that many of the people who, not many, there were clearly some people who were coming over from Gaza to work were coming as Hamas operatives to gather intelligence so that when they came into Israel to do this, they would know exactly where to go and what was most vulnerable. And so the sense of betrayal of people who, and as you know, you've read about this, these are the peaceniks. These are we have to find ways of coexistence. These are the people who are driving residents of Gaza to the hospitals in Israel for their appointments at many of these kibbutzim and moshavim. The left of the left, whose Gazan employees, some of whom were essentially doing intelligence gathering to help make the killing more efficient in the end. I don't know why I can't keep, I've got out of, I guess, hold on one second. Slideshow. Okay, I'm just going to do this by manually. Can you see this? So this is Barzilai Hospital in Ashkelon. You know what you're looking at? The scene of where a bomb hit. That brick wall has just been rebuilt. Doesn't get a lot of press in the United States that Israeli hospitals were bombed. There were 3 rockets that hit Barzilai Hospital. We met the head of the hospital, a guy named Chezi Cohen, who was saying that they were the closest trauma site. So they're the place that got the vast majority of the early victims. And he said, look, I've worked in war zones, and I've never seen what I saw. The kind of carnage. And he said we had to turn ourselves from a civilian hospital into a trauma hospital because we were the first. Obviously, some went to Beersheba, but this was the closest to many, many, many of the Israelis. So I wanted you to see the hospital, and while we were there, we learned we met a guy named Adi Zahavi, who runs an organization called Emergency Volunteers Project. And they have been working on this for years. They have been working with, they work with firefighters and they work with physicians who live outside of Israel, who get training in how Israeli procedures are done in Israeli hospitals and Israeli firefighting units. They get training so that in the event of emergency, people can come and already be pre-certified to be able to practice and to do the work in Israel. So we met one of the doctors who has come from Baltimore, who was working in the ER for 2 weeks as part of this EVP, this Emergency Volunteers Project. And there are many, they've had 6,000 physicians out from outside of Israel apply to be able to offer care since October 7th. And part of it is that, if you've done the training in advance, you could just come and immediately be put to work. And the physician who spoke to us, who's modern Orthodox, said that he was already, I just want to tell you his little story, that he was inspired because there's a line from the Chafetz Chaim, a great 19th century sage, who says, the quote is, Mi Lashem Elai. The question that we may be asked is, who is on God's side? And it's that question that has always served for him, that sometimes you're called and you have to decide if you're going to answer. And that's what he said animated him and his decision. I'm going to end with just these 2 slides. This was our last night after we had finished at Barzilai. We went back to the hotel, got our things, went out to a restaurant to have dinner. The night we were there was the first night it had been open in a month. Some restaurants are still functioning and people are coming, but many of them, there's, not enough business. So we were their first meal they had served in 30 days. As soon as we finished our meal, though, there was one of the 4 sirens that went off. So we had to get to the bomb shelter. I just want to give you a picture of us, most of us in the stairwell. So we went from there to get back on the bus, and then to get to Ben Gurion. As soon as we got to Ben Gurion for the flight back, there was another siren. So this is the bomb shelter in Ben Gurion. So I really, that is a kind of overview of 2.5 days in Israel at a time of war. And as I said, I want to just leave you with a couple of messages. One is that Israel is united. They may have been incredibly at odds with one another over certain legislation that had been proposed, but they are united. And Israelis, almost to a person, are all completely in agreement that until Hamas is no longer in a position to ever pose any kind of a threat, that they have to stay and finish the job. That is something that is universal that we heard. Number 2, that sense of unity and of being part of Klal Yisrael and wanting to serve and care for one another is evident in every and all aspects of society. From the way in which those who have family members held hostage are held and cared for and talked about and spoken about in all walks of life, to the fact that anyone who is not serving in the IDF and who is able to is volunteering in any and all ways that they can to help in some way. There's this incredible sense of unity. I can tell you that they were grateful that there were Americans who came to be with them at this time. We were told so many times how thankful people were. as I joked before I left and continued to joke, the last thing Israel needed was another rabbi. But what did matter to them was that people wanted to be there and show their solidarity, which is what I think meant so much to so many Israelis yesterday when almost 300,000 people showed up to be there and to be counted. So it's a hurting place, and it's an incredibly resilient place and strong place, and and I think as American Jews we have to continue to do what we're doing. We've got to continue to advocate. We've got to continue to find ways that we can to show concrete support and certainly advocacy. And there's no doubt that Israel is going to do whatever it takes. They will do whatever it takes. And they will try to do it in as humanitarian a way as possible. But the circumstances are really difficult. And I will say that I am grateful to our federation for making this trip possible, for allowing us for those of us who went, to not just be able to read about this and know it somehow in our minds, but to feel it in our bodies. That's what we got from being there. It's not just something that's an abstraction, something that is deep. And that's something that I am incredibly grateful to have had the privilege of being there. So I know I've gone on at some length. It's been an hour or so. It's been, wow, more than an hour. Woo, I don't usually talk this long. I'll take a couple of questions, and then if anyone wants to write a chat or two question in the chat, please feel free. All right, Stuart, on my right.
You talked about the unity and how everybody's chipping in and helping out. I read an article yesterday or the day before, and I was wondering if you had heard much more about it, that even some 3,000 Haredi.
Oh, yeah.
Enlisted and already.
There is the largest influx of Haredi enlistment in the IDF has happened in the last 2 to 3 weeks. As many of you know, we didn't have a lot of opportunity to meet with Haredi Jews, but we had heard that there are more who are stepping forward. This is by no means the majority. But even those who are not serving the IDF, the communities are cooking and feeding and driving and doing things to try to help Israelis. So we have to now say we have to have a little bit more. Those of us who tend to be very critical of the Haredim have to be a little bit more nuanced in how we think about them. But we hope that this might be the beginning of something very beautiful for the state. Richard, yeah.
First of all, Yosha for going between firsthand what's happening in Israel. Number two is mention first responders. You forgot to mention Magen David Adom. 14 of them were killed, others were injured. So that's good also. Now my question is, you met people that live by the Gaza. They always complain to the government that the government did enough to protect them.
Yeah.
And how do they feel about what happened to them?
Yeah.
Do they feel the government left them alone? Because
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, I will say we heard.
and I have another question.
Okay.
The other question is, we're talking about fighting Hezbollah. I think the main culprit is Iran. If we can destroy Iran, there's not going to be any other.
Well, let me start with your last comment first. Clearly, Iran is the main sponsor of both Hezbollah and Hamas. Without Iran, this would not have happened. So it's both of those entities are proxies for Iran. So Iran bears a lot of responsibility for what happened, and so I certainly agree with you on that. The point that you made earlier was also, I think because there's so much trauma and pain, that it's not the first thing you hear from those who lost so many loved ones. But yes, Israelis were led to believe that because of the technology that they had, the sophistication of the drones and of their capacities to the fence and its sensors and the things that they had done to make sure people weren't tunneling below the ground to come in underneath, they felt they were led to believe that they were perfectly safe. And we all went on missions for, months and months, years, right up to the border of Gaza, got to see the Iron Dome, we were there, we were led to believe perfectly safe. This is nothing to worry about. So you're absolutely right. I think clearly there's a sense that right now they're united around what has to be done to defeat. You'll see billboards all over Israel saying, Biyachad, Ninatzech, together we will be victorious, together. So now they're focusing on being together. After this is over, I think there are going to be some really major people will be assigned culpability and responsibility. Myron and then Robin, and then we're going to see if there's anyone on the Zoom, and then we're going to let you guys go back home.
No, would it be fair to say that the Arab Israelis are loyal to Israel? And secondly, would it be fair to say that the vast majority of the people in Gaza actually support?
Great question, Myron. I wish I could be an expert. Yeah, okay. Great questions, both of them. I'll give you my anecdotal impression from my time, but I'm not an expert. So the first question you asked for those on the Zoom that might not have heard is your typical Israeli Palestinian citizen supportive and loyal to the state of Israel? And this woman who's the anchor on the news, who is herself, said that it does cause, on the one hand, there are people who feel grateful to be citizens of the state of Israel, but are cautious about being too vocal in their support of the state of Israel because it will be experienced as being betrayal to those of their people who are maybe not citizens who are suffering. So she says it's a very real conflict issue. She herself feels the majority of Palestinian Israeli citizens, or Arab, I should say, Arab Israeli citizens are grateful to be citizens of the state of Israel, but have a certain kind of pressure not to express that gratitude. The second question you asked is, I will just tell you about the guy who was the head of the intelligence, who basically interrogates. I think that most Israelis feel like there's so much hatred inculcated in the educational system against Jews and against Israel that it seems that your average Palestinian, and look, they have not had easy lives, but your average Palestinian is not particularly interested in coexistence. And a lot of it has to do with the education. That's what we heard. But whether or not that's true, I'm not an expert enough to tell you. But that's what we were led to understand anecdotally. Robin.
That's exactly what I was going to bring up as a philosophical dilemma moving forward about these Palestinians who for decades have been indoctrinated with, little kids watching cartoons, killing Jews, just killing in general. These are children or now adults who've grown up in a culture of, killing is like, slicing an apple, basically. So I think it's an ethical dilemma moving forward. Like, after they eradicate Hamas, then what? Can we coexist with the Palestinians? How is that even possible? They have the same feeling, they just weren't in charge. So I think it's a huge problem. Like, what do you do with all the Palestinians?
Right. Well, anyone that's talking about anything, again, the issue of education has to be. If those of you who are on the Zoom, if you want to ask a question, could you put something into chat? I'm sorry if we're seeing some very lovely comments. But if anyone has a question, I may not be able to unmute you, but if you could put something in chat, I'll read it out loud. My question, okay. Many Arabs from Gaza who are allowed to come to Israel provided Hamas about the intelligence that can be seen. Did you hear any talk about a way of Arabs across the Green Line doing the same thing? That was Don Sable's question. No, Don, I did not. I did not hear any of that because we were mostly focused, because we were there for such a short time, we were really almost exclusively in the areas in the Stod Negev region, in the Negev, and we did not hear a whole lot about what's going on in terms of other parts of Israel and intelligence. Okay, I'm not seeing too many other questions come up. It's been a long night. I see some people who are ready for their next stage of the night, which is nighty-night time. So, sorry, yeah.
Can I just add one thing to Robin's question?
Yeah.
I don't understand with the Palestinian problem in Gaza, why Egypt wouldn't help their people and why Jordan wouldn't help their people and why is it
So Jerry's question is, why are not other neighboring countries helping?
They don't care.
Boy, that's something. I mean, again, it's, yeah. Well, I don't think that there's a sense of Klal Yisrael that works what it does for Jews as it does for those, otherwise they would be one. But, yeah, I certainly am not expert enough to answer that question, so we'll just leave it there.
Can I ask just one?
All right, we have a couple more. Yeah.
Thank you for going. Thank you for taking the time to report back.
You don't need to thank me. I felt deeply called to show solidarity with our people. All right, Ivy, yes, and then, all right, Stuart, you get the last question after Ivy. It's going to be the absolute last question.
Well, it's just like, what can we,
Mm.
and can we adopt a family? Can we, like, you said you had some ideas. Do you want to share that?
Well, one of the ideas I have is that I think we should be trying to do consciousness around the hostages and, be putting things into people's daily or weekly names. One of the women we spoke to who've got family members, there were two women who spoke to us, one of whom grew up on the kibbutz but lived in Tel Aviv, so she was not herself directly involved on the day, but she has 3 relatives who are held hostage. She said, we're demanding that every member of Knesset, there are 120 members of Knesset, have 2 names of people that they know the biography about, they know the story about, they know who they are, and that they keep them, in their consciousness each and every day. There's important, I think we could help to contribute to try to tell a little bit of the stories. Do spotlights on our B'nai Mitzvah, we could do spotlights on people who are currently held captive. I just think we should try to have the consciousness that these are human beings with lives that are not being able to. And again, look, we've asked people to give money to organizations, whether it's the Federation Emergency Fund, or it's Magei David Adom, Memory of Josh. We are asking people to try to think of, the Sables are trying to do some fundraising for some, not with any organizations, but people are trying to get direct help to Israelis who need it. So there are lots and lots of ways to help. Some of you may know that I'm a trustee of a family foundation, and one of the things I'm going to go to my fellow trustees to talk about on Friday is that we try to purchase one of these mobile food kitchens that can be deployed at times of crisis like this and prepare up to 10,000 meals a week for people in these mobile kitchens, and that's a $250,000 ask for one of these mobile kitchens, and that's what we heard. The guy who does the Emergency Volunteers Project, part of what they do is also they do these mobile foods. So that's one of the things I'll be asking my fellow trustees to consider doing this. I thought that felt like such a powerful, and they also operate and give food during non-emergency times too.
What about contacting our senators, congressmen, and?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the one thing I felt after being there in Washington yesterday was that we are so fortunate that there's nothing that anyone in our Senate and Congress can't agree on anything except for supporting Israel. I mean, we had the House Majority Leader, the Senate Majority Leader, the minority whip, all four of them essentially pledged their ongoing commitment to the state of Israel and to funding its military needs, et cetera, et cetera. There was no equivocation. And again, you can feel that some are better than others in terms of their support of Israel. Absolutely not the argument, but the fact that there's one thing that seems to unite the most divided time I've ever lived through as an American is the state of Israel. We should be so grateful for that. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to tell, but I don't see a fracturing over Israel right now in this. Well,
This is actually because the president wants to give $100 billion to Ukraine and Israel. It's tied it up together instead of put Israel aside and give it to Israel.
right, so if nothing is happening because it's either Israel and Ukraine or only Israel, so we'll.
They're not going to agree to it. They're not going to agree to it. But he has to, why should Israel be tied to Ukraine?
I am not, again, we can talk strategy and taxes. I think we're very fortunate. Okay, Stu, you had the last question or something?
How full were your flights each way?
There were fewer empty seats on my way there, a lot of empty seats on my way back. El Al, as you know, is the only airline essentially other than, none of the American domestic carriers are coming into the country at this point. So I'd say it's about 60% full on my way back, about 75% full on my way there.
All right. I have a comment. So I have a suggestion. Ivy said, what can we do? And usually it comes down to volunteering or money, but there's something else that we can do that I didn't really realize until today. One of them I've been doing a lot, social media. We all have to take into account the stretch of social media.
Yeah.
We all know 100, 200, 300, 400 people, and we can reach millions. But what happened to me today was even more interesting. One of my clients who's not Jewish, but is very interested in Israel, and we talked about business, but the first thing he wanted to know was how is my family, and how are the kids. He's very faith-based. He's happens to be African-American Baptist, and very smart. He runs a nice CPA firm, very intelligent. But you know what? We think that everybody knows what's happening in Israel because we do. And he was shocked to hear some of the things that I told him that we think everybody knows about the children beheaded, about everything, about the dismemberment. And even though he watches CNN and other news sources, he didn't understand. So I told him, and then he asked me about the Palestinian conflict and why does everybody hate Israel? And between that and anti-Semitism, what we can really do is talk to everybody that we know, Jewish and non-Jewish, because I'm actually more scared of the anti-Israel Jews, which some of them I didn't even know existed. Excuse me, I get very upset about this. And like today, I read about this group of, it blows my mind, Turi Karta.
Yeah.
You know, so we have to just tell everybody.
So basically, yeah, and I need to let people go at this point, but I just want to say, yeah, I think that's a great idea, that use your own networks to advocate for Israel and get the word out. And we will continue, again, our Israel advocacy group is very strong, but we'll think about, I wanted to talk to you about how we can spotlight some of the hostages on a regular basis and get that information out to the community. So we're open for more ideas, and I think that, we want to, again, continue to do everything we can. So thank you all for being here. And have a good night.
I just want to ask you about the implication to your comment about you were saying the left of the left.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
I mean, the most committed. Yeah.